It is a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity here tonight to welcome you to the 2014 ASOR meeting here in San Diego. Our program committee received a record number of submissions for paper proposals, and they've used those to sculpt a really particularly dynamic and chock-full program for you, and I know we're all going to enjoy the sessions over the next 3 days. We're also very excited about some of the extracurricular events we have available during the meeting. Andy already mentioned on Sunday afternoon the special symposium about our Syrian Heritage Initiative, and we hope that as many of you as possible can stay for that. And also on Thursday night, the special reception at the Qualcomm Institute in La Jolla that our colleagues at the University of California, San Diego are hosting, showcasing their work in technology and cyber archaeology. Tonight, as is our tradition, our meeting begins with a plenary address and with a reception to follow. This year's speaker is Jason Orr. Jason earned his BA in Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania in 1994 and his PhD in Mesopotamian Archaeology at the University of Chicago in 2004. He's currently Professor of Anthropology at Harvard University, where he's been since 2005. During his career, Jason has worked on many different aspects of archaeology in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. Among his major interests are cities, especially their origins and early development, and he is the author of Urbanism and Cultural Landscapes in Northern Syria, the Tell Hamoukar Survey, 1999 through 2001, published in 2010, and he's currently at work on a book for Oxford University Press, The Evolution of Mesopotamian Cities. Likewise, Jason's most recent article, published this year in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, is on early urbanism, households, and the emergence of cities in ancient Mesopotamia. But I'd also like to draw your attention to another of Jason's 2014 articles, Multi-Temporal Fusion for the Detection of Static Spatial Patterns in Multispectral Satellite Images with Application to Archaeological Survey, published in the IEEE Journal of Selected Topics in Applied Earth Observances and Remote Sensing. And I draw your attention because this article points to another of Jason's primary interests in remote sensing. Indeed, Jason has been a pioneer in the use of satellite imagery for researching archaeological sites and landscapes, especially the use of declassified images from Corona, a 1960s and 1970s American spy satellite. And using these data, as he writes in a recent post on the ASOR blog, Jason has been able, quote, to describe a vivid and dense archaeological landscape of sites, of tracks, of canals, and subterranean water chambers, and all, Jason goes on to say, from my office in Cambridge before having ever to set foot on the ground. Now, I might just note parenthetically that I just so happened to have dinner Monday night with one of Jason's colleagues at Brandeis, who works in Mayan archaeology, who lamented that it's not quite so easy to sit in your office in Waltham and stare through a rainforest canopy and see sites, tracks, canals, and so forth in Guatemala. But Jason can do this, and the region to which Jason has most recently brought his interest in remote sensing to bear is the Kurdistan region of Iraq, as the project director of the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey. In that same recent ASOR blog post, Jason describes how exciting it is to work in this region because, for example, of the density of remains, as Jason describes it, one site per square kilometer, 5 times the known density of southern Iraq, and twice what archaeologists have found in the adjacent plains of northern Mesopotamia. And in addition, the Kurdistan region is revealing materials that span a significant period of time, especially materials from both the Middle Assyrian and Neo-Assyrian periods, as well as an abundance of large Sasanian sites. The Assyrian sites, moreover, may suggest a landscape, as Jason writes, carefully planned and executed by its kings and their engineers. So not only is this Kurdistan region of Iraq an exciting place to work, Jason's also noted it's an easy place to work given the enthusiasm and support of the Kurdistan regional government. And ASOR is very, very pleased that we're joined here in San Diego by some of the senior members of the Kurdistan Regional Government's Directorate of Antiquities. A very special welcome to these guests. The Kurdistan region of Iraq will also be the focus of 3 sessions at our meeting: the Archaeology of the Kurdistan region of Iraq 1, 2, and 3 on Saturday at 10:40 through 12:45, 2 through 4:05, and 4:20 through 6:25. And I mention this because the session on Saturday at 4:20 through 6:25 is the last session of the ASOR Annual Meeting. And so we'll end our meeting as we begin tonight with Jason Orr, the Renaissance of Archaeology in Iraq and its Kurdistan region. Welcome, Jason.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that very nice introduction that encompassed quite a bit of the talk I'm about to deliver. Susan clearly did admirable research, but I hope you all will act surprised when you hear my talk here. So, I've been invited to talk to you tonight about the current state of archaeology in the Republic of Iraq, including the Kurdistan region, because as many of you may have noticed, it's been undergoing what I'd characterize as a renaissance in the last 4 years. But before doing so, I'd like to go back 25 years to 1989 and 1990. Now, in these years, Iraq was crawling with archaeologists, foreign and Iraqi. Now, there was reason for optimism. The Iran-Iraq War had ended in the previous years, and archaeologists anticipated that many war-related restrictions on their activities would come to an end. Research might be possible again in the far southern plains, the areas of Sumer that were most closest to the fighting. In those years, there were Americans at Nippur, Germans at Uruk, the French were at Larsa. In the north, the Assyrian capitals at Nineveh and Nimrud were under excavation with new projects that promised to investigate previously unexplored parts of those cities. A Japanese team had returned to the legendary but neglected city of Kish. New projects were underway as well, for example, the holistic approach to urban structure at Mashkan Shapir. And for the first time since Bob Adams in the 1970s, the government was allowing foreigners to undertake survey. This was also a time for talk of renaissances. The Kurdistan region was not part of this movement for grim reasons that I'll discuss shortly. But as we all know, this optimism was short-lived. After a few months of rhetoric from Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi army entered Kuwait in August of 1990, and by January, the US-led coalition began its invasion. Hostilities last until March, with a liberation of Kuwait and a ceasefire. For archaeological research, however, this agreement meant very little. The military actions were accompanied by economic sanctions imposed by the UN that effectively prohibited any transactions with Iraq. For foreign researchers, this meant a complete inability to spend research money. For the next 2 decades, all foreign archaeological research, and nearly all Iraqi research as well, came to a complete halt. Now, despite this hiatus, the archaeology of Iraq still matters tremendously. It is still the realm of many of the firsts that we associate with ourselves, especially relating to social complexity, the first cities, the first states, the first writing, the first empires. Iraq has given us our most commonly used archaeological models. For example, Mesopotamian cities infuse Gordon Child's famous paper on the urban revolution. Now, in this case, a model based largely on Uruk and Ur was generalized to cover all ancient cities globally. Now, this circumstance has been a point of frustration for Mayanists and others, and even now it seems not to describe early cities on the Mesopotamian periphery. Now, we know this because these southern-centric models have now been tested in adjacent regions. The earliest cities in northern Mesopotamia, for example, are contemporary with or slightly earlier than Uruk, but were decentralized, low-density places. Now, under normal circumstances, archaeologists working in Iraq would further test these northern models against southern cities, and in this manner, our knowledge would expand. But because of its isolation, the archaeology of Iraq has missed out on nearly all of the developments of Near Eastern archaeology, and indeed, the developments of archaeology generally. But one part of Iraq missed out entirely, and that's the Kurdistan region of the north. Now, during the late 1980s period of optimism, the Kurdistan region was under attack. Now, many Kurds had risen up against the Baghdad government, and some had actively supported Iran in the war. So visiting Kurdistan for foreign archaeologists was forbidden or very difficult. Now, this was because the Iraqi army was systematically destroying villages and forcing people into new planned settlements. This culminated in the genocidal Anfal campaign of 1988, when villages were also attacked with chemical weapons. A Human Rights Watch estimates that somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Kurdish people, mostly men, were killed or disappeared in the late 1980s. Needless to say, the Ba'athist government did not want these activities to be witnessed by foreigners. And here is another reason why the archaeology of Iraq matters. It could be the source of great national pride and a more unified sense of identity. Now, in the Kurdistan region, its people are eager for their own history. In the south, the great civilizations of Sumer and Babylonia were neither Shia nor Sunni. Their accomplishments in literature, law, and urbanization could be a pan-Iraqi source of national pride, as it has been in the past. Now, these goals are not without great challenges, however, but a renaissance in archaeology in Iraq could benefit far more than a small community of scholars. But we are still talking about Iraq, a place that a casual observer of world news would still regard as unstable and very dangerous. Now, more careful observers will have noticed a qualitative decline in news stories featuring bombings and attacks, and perhaps they've even heard of the economic success of the Kurdistan region. But I can attest that even among my archaeologist friends, there still is a very strong sense that Jason and his colleagues returning to Iraq need their heads checked. So, on that matter, at this point, we need to take a brief detour into the geography and recent history of the Republic of Iraq. So you see here the major cities and governorates as they were in the year 2000. Now, Iraq is highly diverse. Muslim Arabs predominate, with Shia concentrated in Baghdad and to the south, and Sunni also in Baghdad and to the west and to the north to Mosul. Now, Kurds predominate in the mountains to the northeast and the adjacent plains. The Kurds of Iraq are overwhelmingly Shia Muslim, but their identities come first from their common ethno-linguistic background. Now, the 20th century was a time of Sunni dominance. Conflicts with the Shia simmered, but the Kurds were often in an open state of revolt. In 1970, the Baghdad government unilaterally created the autonomous Kurdistan region, including Dohuk, Erbil, and Sulaymaniyah governorates. It then began shifting troublesome Kurdish populations out of the other governorates and into this region. And this was particularly the case in Kirkuk, where Kurds were replaced with Arabs in an attempt to Arabicize this oil-rich region. Now, following the first Gulf War, Kurdish autonomy expanded. In August 1991, the Iraqi army pulled out of the Kurdistan region. Peshmerga forces established a territory that included most of the majority Kurdish parts of the country. Now, Shia revolts in the south were much less successful, and they were put down violently. There was a radical increase in looting in the absence of central control, especially in the south of the country. This brings us to April 2003. The American-led invasion was deceptively quick, but it led to a humanitarian disaster. We can demonstrate this quantitatively. In October 2010, the website wikileaks.org posted almost 400,000 tactical reports of the US military. These reports describe individual attacks, and they include very accurate latitude and longitude coordinates. These data extend from the start of the war until the end of December 2009, and they describe 109,000 deaths. Now, we see here the data plotted by individual attack up to December of 2009. Now, it's easier to visualize, however, as a continuous ratio of deaths per 100 square kilometers. In the first 4 years of the American occupation, violence was endemic throughout the country, but especially in the Baghdad region. Also dangerous was Mosul, Basra, and Kirkuk. But starting in 2011, attacks declined, especially outside of the urban hotspots. The towns and villages of the Shia area corresponding to the heartland of cities, two projectors is a little challenging here, saw only sporadic attacks. The change in the Kurdistan region was even more dramatic. Now, Kurdistan had never seen intensive violence, but between 2008 and 2009, there were almost zero attacks. So it was within this context of demonstrable reduction in violence that antiquities officials in Baghdad and Erbil began to invite foreign archaeologists back to Iraq. I'll now give an overview of the past 4 years of fieldwork. Now, I'll emphasize what I regard as the main directions of research. Archaeological research has not been evenly distributed across the country. The large majority of new work is taking place in the Kurdistan region for a variety of reasons that I will explain. But the south of Iraq is also part of this renaissance, and I will begin there. Now, while foreign research all but stopped in 1990, Iraqi work did continue on a small scale. Now, all too often, this work was done in response to the increase in looting following the first Gulf War. For example, the important third millennium city of Ummah was badly hit by looters. The SBAH began excavations there in 1999. The team recovered nothing less than the famous Temple of Shara, the city god of Ummah. In addition to the temple architecture, the excavators found 19 in situ Ur III tablets. Now, of the many thousands of Ur III tablets from Ummah, these are, to my knowledge, the only ones with archaeological context, and they are now published. Now, Iraqi work was not limited to excavations. Between 2003 and 2010, Abdul-Amir al-Hamdani was the chief inspector of the Kar Governorate. With very little resources, he conducted reconnaissances throughout the governorate, especially in the marsh areas outside of the areas of the classic surveys of Adams and Nissen. Hamdani's surveys have documented over 1,200 archaeological sites, and they are now the subject of his Stony Brook University PhD dissertation. Now, Amir and other Iraqi archaeologists have worked under hostile conditions with very little resources. So it's no surprise that much of this work remains unpublished and therefore unknown to foreign archaeologists like most of us. Now, some help has come from a publication initiative of the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq, or TARI. Now, TARI has funded Iraqi archaeologists to prepare their work for translation and publication. About a dozen Iraqi-authored works are now in print. They describe excavations at Akar Kuf, at Tel Walaya, Tel Muhammad, and others. They appear in journals such as Ekatika and Iraq. Now, forthcoming publications on Tel Asmar, ancient Eshnunna, and the Nimrud Queen's tombs will appear in the University of Chicago Oriental Institute publication series. English language publication will give these Iraqi archaeologists international credit for their work. Now, I turn now to recent foreign research in the South. Now, foreign excavations began with the return of American archaeology to Iraq. A team from Stony Brook University began excavation at Tel Sakhariya, near Ur. Now, the Sakhariya excavations are interesting for what they haven't found, and that is very much architecture. Now, the remains, which date to the mid-2nd millennium BC, are probably semi-sedentary traces, or even reed-built structures, probably related to the Sealands dynasty. Now, 20th century archaeologists were entirely focused on mud brick architecture and would certainly have disregarded such remains as these. Now, Zachariah suggests that marsh-based lifeways are accessible to archaeological research if we look for them properly. Now, Tell Abu Tabera and Tell Khyber are two additional new excavations. At Tell Abu Tabera, Italian archaeologists have found an early dynastic cemetery. Now, British archaeologists working at Tell Khyber have begun to excavate a public building of the Old Babylonian era. Now, both of these projects are in their initial stages, but with promising first results, and their excavators are here at ASOR to present on Friday afternoon. Now, the Tell Khyber research relies heavily on remote sensing. Indeed, that is where the most exciting regional research work has been based. A project led by Elizabeth Stone uses high-resolution satellite imagery to map not just sites, but their internal structure. Now, differences in soil moisture and salinity, they reveal buried walls, streets, and canals. Now, this work is not merely mapping extant walls. It is proposing new spatial models. So this work is proposing new spatial models for early cities. These are related to political economy of animals at the earliest stages of Mesopotamian statehood. Now, another regional project may be similarly disruptive. Now, in her 2003 dissertation, Jennifer Pornell proposed that Uruk and other early cities grew on the basis of marsh resources and not on early cereal agriculture, as every other model has always assumed. Now, she proposed this using remote sensing, topographic analysis, and the survey data of Robert Adams and others. Now, needless to say, this is a very controversial hypothesis. But now Pornell and her collaborator, Carrie Ritz, are working with Iraqi colleagues from the University of Basra to give this hypothesis a rigorous field test. Now, they suspect that irrigation was actually an after effect of the drying of the marshes. Now, this work will be featured in a dedicated session on Saturday morning. Now, I want to turn now to a major cultural heritage project. There is probably no site more famous in Iraq than Babylon. It has not fared well, however, since the glory days of Nebuchadnezzar. In the 20th century, it became a potent tourist attraction, but also a powerful national symbol. Saddam ordered extensive reconstruction, but he also built palaces on the site. Now, under American occupation, Babylon hosted a military installation, which caused further damage. Now, since 2005, the World Monuments Fund has monitored the site, and it has developed a site management plan and conservation plan in collaboration with the SBAH. Babylon will be nominated to the World Heritage List as a cultural landscape, meaning all of these interventions, including Saddam and the Americans, will be recognized as part of the history of this unique place. Well, these are promising new starts, but archaeology in southern Iraq is still very challenging. Now, some of these challenges still relate to security. It's not a coincidence that foreign excavations are clustered tightly around Ur and Talil Air Force Base, which encloses the site. All three projects share dig houses within this secure zone. Now, this is a level of security that is not available in the countryside. Now, a further challenge is political. The SBAH is eager to return to fieldwork and site management in collaboration with foreign archaeologists. At the ministerial level, however, archaeology is still susceptible to geopolitics. Until recently, the Minister of Culture was hostile to an American presence of any kind in Iraq. Now, with the new government in place, there is optimism once again that Americans will be welcomed. Now, at this point, I want to turn our attention to the north. The dramatic expansion of archaeological research in the Kurdistan region is taking place in a different context. Now, compared to the south of Iraq, the archaeology of Kurdistan is nearly unknown. We can point to some famous projects, for instance, Shanidar Cave or Neolithic Jarmo. A few excavations were undertaken by the SBAH in the 1960s and 1970s. There were reconnaissances in the 1940s, but these focused really only on the largest sites. Since 2003, some small-scale work has been carried out by Kurdish archaeologists in Sulaymaniyah and in Erbil. And all of this work is significant, but it is isolated. In short, the archaeology of the Kurdistan region was mostly a blank canvas until very recently. Now, the second factor is a uniquely favorable opinion towards foreigners generally, but Americans in particular. At a time when public opinion about the United States is generally low globally, Americans are highly regarded by the Kurdish people and their government. Americans and EU citizens are granted entry and a visa upon arrival at Erbil International Airport. And this openness has extended to American archaeologists, and at present there are 5 projects directed by faculty of American universities in Kurdistan. Now, I must begin with the most famous site in the region, the Citadel of Erbil. Erbil, or Hawler in Kurdish, is the modern capital of the Kurdistan region, but it is also a major archaeological site. Now, over the last century, the elite of Erbil began to move off of the mound and into the expanding lower town, and their ancestral homes began to deteriorate. Now, with peace and economic prosperity, the citadel, or Kala, has become a powerful symbol of Kurdish identity. Its narrow streets are lined with late Ottoman and early 20th century buildings, many in desperate need of stabilization. The High Commission for Erbil Citadel Revitalization was formed to develop plans for its conservation and management. This past June, the Citadel was formally inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Restoration and conservation work continues, and soon visitors will be able to step back in time and walk through the Erbil Citadel of 1 century ago. Now, Erbil is a proper tell, and it rises 30 meters over the plain. Now, surface collections have been made on its slopes, and they show that it has been occupied for at least 6 millennia. Unlike the citadel in Aleppo, however, Erbil's mound is almost entirely residential. The famous Temple of Ishtar, for example, may prove to be impossible to find. The same situation applies to Erbil's vast lower town. Today, it is covered entirely by modern Erbil. Now, historical remote sensing can help. A Czech team has used historical photographs and corona satellite imagery to examine the town before its 20th century expansion. The team found linear features and brought them together to describe several series of city walls. All of these are now beneath the modern fabric. Now, ground confirmation is needed, but Assyrian Erbil may have been as large as about 350 hectares. Now, this is the same size range as the capitals at Nimrud and Khorsabad, and is much larger than all of the other known provincial capitals. Now, as important as it is, Erbil is only one site. A gold rush is on to fill in the archaeological map of the Kurdistan region. At least 12 survey projects are now underway. Now, this is a very exciting development because we don't know very much about sites in the region. We have the record of the Archaeological Atlas of Sites in Iraq, which was published in 1979 but was based on reconnaissance in the 1940s. So it is useful, but short on details, and it greatly underrepresents the density of archaeological sites. Now, compared to southern Iraq, which has been extensively surveyed, there were no systematic archaeological surveys in Kurdistan until only recently. Now, the importance of full coverage surveys cannot be understated. After decades of neglect, the region is developing rapidly. Cities are expanding, roads are being built, dams are being planned. All of these activities are taking a heavy toll on the cultural landscape. Without knowledge of what's out there, our colleagues in the Directorates of Antiquities cannot act to preserve this cultural heritage. Now, these projects reverse the recent trend towards small and intensive surveys in Syria and Turkey. Nearly all of these projects cover vast territories. Only 2 are less than 1,000 square kilometers, and half are 3,000 square kilometers or more. The survey of Sulaymaniyah Governorate covers the entire 18,000 square kilometers of the province. Now, they are all primarily vehicular, None use systematic walking transects. Now, in this sense, they are a continuation of the tradition of Bob Adams rather than an extension of more recent trends. But in some ways, they are geographic extensions. The Sirwan Regional Project covers almost 4,000 square kilometers on the upper Diyala River, the Sirwan in Kurdish. It is nearly adjacent to Adams' groundbreaking Diyala survey. The survey has already identified over 400 sites. Now, more than any other new survey, the Sirwan project will allow a comparison between the classic landscape projects of the 1960s and this new generation of fieldwork. Now, in Adams' day, sites were mapped with a compass and a sheet of graph paper. Sirwan and the Eastern Habur Archaeological Survey are both employing new techniques with imagery from unmanned aerial vehicles to produce high-resolution topographic models and even virtual archaeological sites. These technologies would have resulted in prison sentences under the former regime. Very exciting. So how can these surveys operate on such enormous scales? Well, all of them are heavily reliant on remote sensing, and particularly historical imagery of the Corona program. As an example of the power of Corona, let's go about 15 kilometers east from Nimrud to the area of Qasr Shamamik. This is a major Assyrian provincial capital. Now, the city's citadel and its lower town have been known for a long time. This place was first visited by Austin Henry Layard. But what about its hinterland? Well, when I look at this image, I'll have to be loud here, I see more than just this walled city. I see an archaeological site here. I see another one right here. I see small sites here and in here. And if you follow along the course of the river, almost all of these white spots that you can see very clearly, all of these are separate archaeological sites. In some, I can see almost 3 dozen archaeological sites in this image, in addition to the known site of Qasr Shamamik. Now, this sort of sheeting is simply the only way we can cover areas that are this vast. So what we're learning is that the density of archaeological sites in the Kurdistan region is absolutely tremendous. Now, by sites here, I refer to sedentary habitation sites. Now, so we can compare the early results in terms of sites per square kilometer. Now, in yellow here are the classic surveys of southern Iraq, undertaken by Adams and his colleagues in the 1960s. Now, they recorded on average about 1 site per 5 to 10 square kilometers. Now, in orange are recent surveys in northern Mesopotamia, mostly Syria and Turkey. Now, these surveys were carried out by Tony Wilkinson and his students. Now, they treat much smaller areas, and they operated at a much higher intensity. Now, these surveys recovered around 0.5 sites per square kilometer. Now, finally, the red surveys fall in Erbil and Dohuk. These projects are returning in excess of 0.8 sites per square kilometers, and in some subregions, they are recovering nearly 1 per square kilometer. Now, some caveats are in order. The Kurdistan surveys use remote sensing and technologies that Adams could not have imagined. There is also a taphonomic factor at play. The landscape of southern Iraq is far more dynamic, and sites get lost in shifting rivers and in dune fields. Nonetheless, I don't believe these factors account for all of these differences. The Kurdistan region contains some incredibly rich archaeological landscapes. And a final general point I'd like to make about these surveys is how collaborative they are. Now, many teams have recognized that through collaboration, all of our work is improved, and we all benefit from high professionalism in the archaeology of the Kurdistan region. Now, most of the survey directors are in close communication. We share satellite imagery, topographic maps, and especially our working pottery chronologies. In a region with a short history of research, this is not just collegial behavior. This is necessary for us to get our work done. Now, a slightly more formal collaboration has been formed between survey teams in Dohuk and Erbil governorates. Teams from 4 universities are working together closely. We discuss field methods to cover large regions at suitable intensity. We share ceramic typologies, And in a region where, and this is in a region where published sequences are very rare. We operate off of nearly identical base data, including shared corona emissions and digital elevation models. We are producing complementary results that will allow us to tackle the big questions of settlement and landscape, and to answer them more authoritatively than we could if we were operating in isolation. Now, there is no shortage of excavations to go with these surveys. The General Directorate in Erbil has signed contracts for almost 50 projects. Nearly every time period is being investigated, from the Paleolithic in Shanidar Cave to the late Ottoman bazaars of Erbil. Most are only recently underway, and some have only carried out mapping or surface collection. However, we can make some early generalizations. Now, all governorates are being investigated, but excavations are clustering in a few high-visibility regions. Now, the greatest density falls on the Erbil Plain. This isn't surprising. The plain is exceedingly rich in archaeological sites. It's also close, both geographically and culturally, to known regions of northern and southern Mesopotamia. It therefore has a low cost of entry for archaeologists who may have worked in Syria or Turkey. It also has a lot of large sites, both vertically and horizontally, that have always attracted archaeologists. Now, excavators have also been attracted to Sulaymaniyah Governorate. Its 24 active or recent archaeological excavations are more than Erbil and Dohuk combined. Now, projects cluster in the Sharazor Valley between Sulaymaniyah and Halabja. This is another broad alluvial region that is highly productive today, as it was in the past, and capable of supporting large and dense populations. So what have we learned so far? Well, in most cases, it's rather early to gauge how existing ideas about Mesopotamian history are going to be challenged. But already, there are hints of exciting new discoveries to come. Now, here, I'll try to pull together the most interesting new elements that I'm aware of. Now, Kurdistan was the locus of some of the most innovative early work in the Neolithic, and that's set to happen again. In the 1940s and the 1950s, the University of Chicago Prehistoric Project did path-breaking work at Jarmo, near Chemchemal. Robert Braidwood was convinced that the origins of agriculture were to be found in the hilly flanks of the Zagros, where the wild ancestors of wheat and barley were found. Now, the UCL paleobotanist Dorian Fuller has resumed excavations at the site. To the east, in the Sharazor Plain, a team from the University of Reading has undertaken several seasons of excavation at the pre-pottery Neolithic site of Bestansur. Now, architectural remains include heavily plastered mud brick and pisé, and several human burials have been recovered. The people of Bestansur were exploiters of both wild and domesticated species. In the coming years, the Central Zagros Prehistoric Project and the Jarmo excavations promise to expand our understanding of the Neolithic in the Zagros. The late 5th and early 4th millennia were a time of great social change, and some of the most exciting recent research in northern Mesopotamia has focused on this time of incipient complexity. On the Erbil Plain, excavations are underway at one such site, Tell Hamoukar, a 30-hectare site southwest of Erbil. Now, its lower town appears to be mostly Islamic, but at center is a large and high mound that appears to cover the entire 5th and 4th millennia BC. Soundings and a step trench are under excavation by a University of Chicago-led team. The uppermost levels of Chalcolithic Sorasia are characterized by beveled rim bowls and other material culture that seems more at home at Uruk in southern Iraq. Now, Sorasia is not alone. Khani Shai is a multi-period mound near Sulaymaniyah, about 1.5 hectares. This Portuguese-American project digging there has found late Uruk architecture, but also a sealed mathematical tablet, unfortunately out of context. Now, before we conclude that Sorasia and Khani Shai are enclaves or colonies of southern Mesopotamians, let's consider the settlement pattern on the Uruk Plain, the Erbil Plain. Sites are uniformly small, but their assemblages are also uniform, with bevel rim bowls and grit-tempered forms that are typical of the so-called Uruk expansion sites. So was this just a heavily colonized area? So what I don't see here are the indigenous forms, the chaff-tempered types that are known from northern Mesopotamia. So at this stage, it looks like our core and periphery models don't apply so well here. Or it could be that large parts of the Kurdistan region might just simply be part of the core. The fourth millennium has been subject to some of the best archaeological synthesizing in recent years, and I'm looking forward to seeing the Kurdistan region take its place in these debates. Now, in the 3rd millennium BC, early Bronze Age, cities arrived permanently in northern Mesopotamia, and a landscape of city-states appeared in the south. Where does the Kurdistan region fit in? Most of the largest early Bronze Age sites are small compared to the megacities of southern Iraq. Now, a few, however, appear to be part of the northern Mesopotamian urban tradition. Bakarawa in Shahrazor, for example, has a high mound and an extensive lower town covering 40 hectares. It has been under excavation by a German team. But for the largest new early Bronze Age city, we return to the Erbil Plain. Tel Hamoukar has a small but steep mound at center with several thousand years of occupational history. Its height brought it to the attention of the Greek archaeological mission in Mesopotamia, but its satellite signature got the attention of my survey. The high mound covers about 5 hectares, but it's surrounded by a lower town that covers an additional 90 hectares. A surface collection revealed a history of expansion and contraction, but with a maximum expansion at the time of the early Bronze Age. It's likely that nearly all of its 95 hectares were occupied at this time. Now, if that is the case, Bakarta was contemporary with, but larger than, Ebla, Tel Brak, and even Ur. Now, the Middle Bronze Age was also an urban period. Excavations at Tel Shamshara on the Rania Plain are reopening a public building of the era of Shamshi Adad. Bakr Awa also remained a major urban center at this time. Near Erbil, a lot of effort has gone into locating the lost city of Kabra. We know of Kabra from inscriptions of Dadusha of Eshnunna and Shamshi Adad, both of whom claimed to have been instrumental in the siege and destruction of Kabra and its kingdom. Now, the search for Kabra has focused on the area south of Erbil, where Bakarta and other large sites are to be found. Now, these large sites include a low but extensive mound at Kurd Kabristan. Now, from above, this site is striking. It's bordered to the northeast by a linear watercourse. Now, this is not how water behaves. Now, in staring at this image, again from my office in Cambridge, eventually I stopped looking at the linear watercourse and I started following a white line stretching around like this. It looks an awful lot like a city wall. Collections at the site revealed that Middle Bronze Age surface artifacts covered most of the site. Now, excavations by Johns Hopkins University began in 2013. They've explored the upper levels of the Mitanni area, including domestic structures. But the project also includes a geophysical survey component. The results here are absolutely remarkable. Geophysical survey reveals city wall bastions at nice, even 20-meter intervals. The identification of Kurd Kabristan with Kabra is by no means certain, but we can definitely say that this large city had a very strong city wall. Now, in the late Bronze Age, there is interest in the Mitanni period, but with the exception of Kurd Kabristan, it remains underexplored. We are, however, learning a lot about the time of Middle Assyrian domination. For one, the Neo-Assyrian at Qasr Shamamak has turned out to be just as big in the Middle Assyrian period, if not actually bigger. But very interesting results come from the eastern fringes of the Middle Assyrian state. At Satukala, on the lower Zab, a team from Leiden and Leipzig has discovered the city of Idu. Now, Idu emerged from the collapse of the Middle Assyrian state. The site itself appears to be small, although it is obscured by a modern village. The excavations have revealed out-of-context glazed tiles with the names of at least 7 independent kings. Now, continued work promises to reveal more about the small-scale polities in this so-called Dark Age that followed the Late Bronze Age collapse. But the greatest advances thus far have occurred in the Iron Age. The archaeology of the Assyrian provinces has been booming in recent years, with dramatic discoveries at Tel Sheikh Hamad and Tel Halaf in Syria, and Ziyaret Tepe Zinjirli and Tel Tayanat in Turkey. But until recently, we had little new to say about the Assyrian core. Well, much of the imperial core was located in what is today the Kurdistan region. Now, all of the capital cities have been excavated, but our information is incredibly uneven. We know intimate details of royal palaces, but we know nearly nothing about the mundane urban life within these cities. There have been no systematic surveys of Assyria proper. The rural countryside was an archaeological void. We have hints about landscape features. There's some rock reliefs, there's some canals, dams, and even an aqueduct. But until recently, these observations were all either anecdotal or based on satellite imagery. Now, these elements can be brought together in a hypothetical model of the Assyrian landscape, one that stresses a high degree of top-down planning. Capital cities were planned and created. Deportees were forcibly resettled within them and also placed out in the countryside. At the same time, an enormous system of canals brought water to the capitals and to the rural areas surrounding them. Symbols of Assyrian power in rock reliefs and stelae were spread out among them. In sum, it can be hypothesized that the Assyrian state transformed nearly all aspects of its landscape: settlement, demography, even hydrology. But this hypothesis has been desperately in need of testing on the ground. Now, the most important Assyrian site is, of course, Erbil itself, which was an important core provincial capital. Now, as part of the revitalization program, areas have been set aside for archaeological excavation. The goal is, in part, to locate Erbil's famous Temple of Ishtar. Erbil, unfortunately, has a long post-Assyrian history, so this is going to be a challenge. Now, another capital is much more accessible. Qasr Shamamak, ancient Kilazu, falls directly between Nimrud and Erbil. A French team has excavated the site since 2010. Now, the top of the citadel has deep remains of the Hellenistic and Parthian periods. In a step trench, however, a paved ramp of the Assyrian period led diagonally up the slope. Some of the paved bricks have an inscription of Sennacherib, which mentions the construction of 2 city walls. The Assyrian countryside is also starting to take shape. 2 surveys in Dohuk and Erbil focus particularly on the question of Assyrian rural settlement and land use. Now, the longest of Sennacherib's canals stretched nearly 95 kilometers from its canal head at the site of Khinis. Now, along the way, it crossed an aqueduct of some 400,000 blocks at the site of Jirwan. The general outline of the canal was known since the 1930s, but fantastic new details are emerging. An Italian survey is now tracing the full course of the canal. At the head of the canal are the famous reliefs at Khinis. And the team has produced a 3D laser scan model of this monument and also the aqueduct at Jirwan. But they have found that Jirwan is only one of several such constructions along its course. There are 6 others in various states of preservation that line this canal. And we now know that Sennacherib's watercourses were not moving through a vacant landscape. The Italian project sees an explosion of small Neo-Assyrian sites, especially in the broad Navkur plain. Now, there they might have benefited from the waters of the Khinis Canal. The settlement pattern seems to support the idea of a planned state agricultural colonization. Now, the Neo-Assyrian landscape is also driving the survey on the Erbil Plain. In the late Bronze Age, sites clustered along the perennial watercourses. But in the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, site numbers had expanded dramatically. Settlements were now positioned in the dry areas between the rivers, where access to water was unreliable. Now, this is a very unnatural pattern, and one that might have resulted from the deliberate resettlement by the Assyrian state. The sites are uniformly small as well, on average about 1.5 hectares. Now, in Erbil, these sites are also found with abundant traces of canals. Several massive canals cross the plain below Qasr Shamamik. The largest is 100 meters wide and about 8 meters deep. It runs north and terminates in a massive basin, which is about 300 meters across, also about 8 meters deep. Now, the mechanics of this canal are difficult to understand, but it is associated with several Neo-Assyrian sites and has strong morphological similarities to known Assyrian canals elsewhere. Now, as core Assyrian landscapes are emerging, so is the eastern periphery. Now, some of the most interesting new work is in the highland valleys of the Zagros. In the Soran area, an American team is investigating ancient Musasir. The Rwanda's archaeological project is surveying sites in these high valleys, including initial research on Kalat Mujesser, the likely location of ancient Musasir and its famous Temple of Haldi. Now, simultaneously, the project is engaging in rescue work alongside road construction, including settlements and cemeteries of the late Iron Age. Finally, excavations have commenced at Girdi Dasht, the largest mound on the Soran plain. Now, in Sulaymaniyah, surveys and excavations are illuminating ancient Simurum, Lelubum, and Mazamua, famously troublesome kingdoms on Mesopotamia's highland fringes. Around Sulaymaniyah, a French project has surveyed the Tanjiro Valley and has now started excavations. A multidisciplinary project is in operation in the Sharazor Valley as well. Now, this project is bringing together geoarchaeology, survey, and historical geography. Now, this research is starting to appear in international journals, but in the Kurdistan region, there is a new venue, Subartu, the journal of the Kurdistan Archaeology Syndicate. Subartu publishes in English, Kurdish, and Arabic, and covers history, archaeology, and cultural heritage in the Kurdistan region, Iraq generally, and Western Iran. And I can also attest that it publishes promptly. I can attest. I've reviewed developments in southern Iraq and in the Kurdistan region, but I want to say a few things about some pan-Iraqi initiatives. Now, the cultural heritage infrastructure of Iraq suffered under sanctions and was ravaged by the upheaval following the invasion and occupation. The international community is attempting to help, particularly the United States. A U.S. State Department grant is helping rebuild archaeology at the University of Mosul. Until recent years, the university trained archaeologists from throughout Iraq. Now Mosul has joined with Boston University to train and rebuild the archaeological capacity of the university. And unfortunately, despite a great start, recent political events with ISIS have put this project on hiatus. Now, the locus for this project has not been Mosul, but rather in one of the best success stories of recent years, the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage. The Institute's mission is to strengthen cultural heritage management capacity throughout Iraq. Since 2009, it has trained more than 50 specialists in conservation, architectural preservation, and archaeology. These students then go back to their directorates and museums, and there they train others. The teaching staff is mostly American conservation professionals and academics, including many ASOR members. But the Institute leadership is composed of Kurds and Arabs from throughout the country, led by Dr. Abdullah Khorshid of Salahuddin University. Institutes offering training through the Institute include the University of Delaware, the University of Rome, and the World Monuments Fund. Now, finally, efforts are being made to bring Iraqis to the United States for graduate training. Via the University of South Carolina, Jennifer Pornell has facilitated the migration of 1,500 Iraqis into American universities in dozens of disciplines. And thanks to Jenny's heroic efforts, many of them end up staying in South Carolina. Now, there are many positives to talk about in recent archaeology in Iraq. Models to be tested in southern Iraq, the blank slate of the Kurdistan region beginning to be written upon, multinational efforts to build a strong heritage infrastructure and to train the next generation. But there are also enormous challenges to this nascent Renaissance. The same social and economic forces that have brought it about also threaten it. This is especially true in the Kurdistan region. Erbil, for example, grew rapidly in the late 20th century, and its growth has become exponential since the mid-1990s. Since 2003, Erbil has become a haven for internally displaced persons. The best-case scenario is when a site might be preserved as an island, as is in the case of Kilik Mishik near Erbil. But for every one Kilik Mishik, there are 10 other sites that disappear under development of settlement or road expansion. We must move fast, and we must train Kurds and Iraqis generally to preserve their own cultural heritage. Initiatives like the Mosul Project and the Iraqi Institute are very good starts. And then there is ISIS. Now, as of this moment, this group controls a huge swath of western and northern Iraq. It threatens Baghdad daily and menaces along a vast frontier with the Kurdistan region. In Mosul, it has dissolved the university's faculty of archaeology altogether. ISIS does not just neglect cultural heritage, it actively targets it for destruction. We all know the story of the Mosque Nebi Yunus, the shrine of the prophet Jonah, that was leveled. There are dozens of other reports, most of them very difficult to verify. We shudder to think what might be happening to other sites under its control, including Hatra, Nimrud, and the sites of the Nineveh Plain. ASOR's Syrian Heritage Initiative has been expanded to include ISIS-held areas of Iraq, and I encourage all of you to attend the Sunday sessions on its activities. Now, despite the activities of ISIS, research continues cautiously in the Kurdistan region. When ISIS seized Guer and Mahmur and threatened Erbil in early August, many projects in the Kurdistan region canceled their work, including mine. But the Peshmerga have pushed ISIS back, and most projects scheduled for late September and October proceeded with their work. So I will end on this slightly positive note. Now, with the halting of the ISIS advance and governmental changes in Baghdad, we might be optimistic again that this renaissance will continue. Many of our colleagues from the south of Iraq and from the Kurdistan region are with us here in San Diego. From Basra, we have the Director of Antiquities, Kahtan Al-Abid, and we have Professor of Geology, Badir Al-Badran. Both will present papers on Saturday morning. We also have a large delegation from the Kurdistan region. Its head is the Director of Antiquities, Abu Bakr Zendin Mala'awat, and with him is Dr. Hassan Ahmed, the Director of Dohuk Government, Kamal Rashid, the Director of the Suleymaniya Governorate, and Abdul Wahab Suleiman from the Soran District. We also have Ramyar Johar and Rafiq Rasul from the General Directorate in Erbil. And finally, a great partner of American archaeologists in the Kurdistan has been Najat Abdullah, from the Director of Community and Culture in the KRG's U.S. representation in Washington, D.C. Now, for most of them, this is their first visit to the United States, Kurds and Iraqis from the South as well. And I encourage all of you to stop them and give them a welcome. And finally, I want to highlight the many sessions containing papers about southern Iraq and Kurdistan that will be featured at this year's ASOR. Nearly all of the surveys and excavations that I have mentioned only in passing out of necessity will be described in far more detail than I've been able to here. And I encourage you to come and hear about this exciting new work. Obviously, I cannot do them all justice right here. And in concluding, I want to thank, first of all of the people that I just showed on the slides from Iraq and from the Kurdistan region for allowing this renaissance to begin and for encouraging us Americans to come and be part of this writing of this new Iraqi history. And finally, I'd like to thank the organizers of ASOR for inviting me to speak to you here tonight, and I'd like to thank all of you for your attention.